The night had just begun to settle over the city. A blanket of darkness stretched over the streets, and the flicker of neon signs reflected in the puddles left by a sudden downpour. A towering office building gleamed in the distance, its glass facade reflecting the streetlights like a mirror to the chaotic world below. Inside the building, Rachel Morgan was still working, as she often did, long after the office should have been empty. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. She had a reputation for diligence and precision, a businesswoman who climbed the ranks swiftly and efficiently. At the young age of 32, she was the CEO of a highly successful tech startup that provided security solutions for government agencies. Her company had become a cornerstone in providing cutting-edge surveillance systems for law enforcement, a fact that had brought her to the attention of a number of powerful people in the city. But not all attention was welcome, and tonight was a stark reminder of that. Rachel sat at her desk, her eyes scanning a report on her latest project, her mind racing through numbers and strategies. Her phone buzzed on the table, but she didn't pick it up immediately. She had learned over the years that distractions could wait, and right now, there were more pressing matters at hand. The report was nearing completion, and soon she would be able to present her findings to the board. As she began to finalize her work, a knock on the door interrupted her focus. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight, and most of the building's staff had already gone home. Rachel rose from her desk, smoothing the hem of her blazer, and walked toward the door. She opened it to reveal two officers in full police uniform, their expressions hard and unwelcoming. "Miss Morgan," one of the officers said, his voice dripping with authority, "we need to have a word with you." Rachel raised an eyebrow, her hand resting on the doorframe. She was no stranger to law enforcement. Her company's systems had been used by the police on several occasions, and she had met with detectives and officers numerous times for business discussions. But there was something about these two men that unsettled her. "Of course, officers. Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone neutral, though her mind was already calculating what this could be about. "We're investigating some irregularities in the use of your company's software," the second officer said, his eyes scanning her office. "Mind if we take a look around?" Rachel's pulse quickened, but she masked her growing unease with a composed smile. "I'm happy to assist with any investigation," she said smoothly. "However, I would prefer if you had a warrant before you start looking through my private office." The first officer scoffed, stepping closer. "You don't get to call the shots here, Miss Morgan. We're just doing our jobs." Rachel's instincts kicked in, and she was immediately aware that something didn't feel right. She could sense the power dynamics shifting, and her mind began to race. These weren't just regular officers. They were bent on something. She felt the weight of their gaze, the tension in the air thickening as they moved closer into her space. "Is there a reason you've come at this hour?" Rachel asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We've had some complaints," the second officer said, his voice growing colder. "Complaints from people who have access to the systems your company has provided. You might want to cooperate, or things could get more difficult for you." Rachel's expression remained unchanged. She had dealt with enough corruption in the industry to recognize when someone was trying to manipulate her. These officers were working for someone. But who? "I don't think you understand, officers," Rachel said, her tone turning firm. "You have no authority to make threats in my office without legal cause. I suggest you leave before I have to get my lawyer involved." The first officer smirked, his eyes narrowing. "You think we're scared of your lawyer, huh? We know all about you, Rachel. You're nothing but a pawn in this city's game. A few calls and your reputation could be ruined." Rachel's mind raced. They were trying to intimidate her to make her back down, but she wasn't going to let them. She could feel the familiar pull of her other identity, one she had kept carefully hidden. Rachel Morgan wasn't just a businesswoman. She had another life, one far removed from her role as the CEO of a tech company. Slowly, she took a deep breath, her mind settling. She had spent years building this reputation as a business leader, but her true power lay elsewhere. She wasn't just any businesswoman. She was a federal agent, an undercover operative working within the very organization that had brought these officers to her door. She had been tasked with investigating corruption within the police force, and these two were just a small part of a much larger operation. With a steely resolve, Rachel's eyes locked onto the first officer. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said softly, her voice calm but full of hidden menace. "I'm not just a businesswoman. I'm a federal agent and you're in my way." The officer's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. For a brief moment the air in the room seemed to freeze, but then the officer let out a short, bitter laugh. "A federal agent," he scoffed. "You think that's going to save you?" Rachel didn't flinch. "You'd be wise to leave now, before I make a few phone calls and ensure that your little operation ends tonight." The officer's smile faltered. He exchanged a quick glance with his partner, the uncertainty in his eyes clear. They hadn't anticipated this. "You're bluffing," the second officer said, though his voice lacked conviction. Rachel didn't need to say another word. She reached for her phone on the desk, her fingers moving with practiced precision. In a few swift motions, she sent a message to her federal contact, the one who had briefed her on the operation against the corrupt cops. Within seconds, her phone buzzed with a reply, "We're on our way. Stand by." The two officers exchanged nervous glances. The confidence they had displayed moments ago had vanished, replaced by a growing unease. "I suggest you leave, gentlemen," Rachel said coolly. "You've made a mistake, and now you need to walk away before things escalate." For a moment there was silence. Then, with visible reluctance, the officers turned on their heels and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind them. Rachel stood still for a moment, her hand still on the doorframe, before she let out a slow breath. She wasn't out of the woods yet. The game had just begun, and Rachel knew she had to be careful. But for now, she had made her point. Rachel stood in the center of her office, her mind processing the events that had just transpired. Her breath came in shallow bursts, but her hands were steady. She had done it. She had revealed herself as a federal agent, a move that had taken immense self-control. But now, as the tension from the officer's visit began to ebb, another realization hit her like a wave. This was far from over. The officers might have walked away for now, but they were just the tip of the iceberg in the vast network of corruption she had been sent to dismantle. The city had its fair share of criminal elements, and for years Rachel had worked in the shadows, gathering evidence and building connections. She had infiltrated corrupt organizations and seen firsthand how deeply the rot ran. But the police force, a pillar of the city's supposed order, was different. This was personal. They were supposed to be the ones who upheld the law, the ones who protected people from the very criminals Rachel was working against. Instead, she had uncovered a web of corruption so intricate that even her federal colleagues were stunned by the depth of it. She quickly made her way to the large window overlooking the city, gazing out at the glowing lights of the skyline. In her reflection, she saw not just the businesswoman everyone knew, but the agent who had fought tooth and nail to reach this moment. She was no longer just Rachel Morgan, the successful tech CEO. She was part of something much larger, a force that would bring down the corrupt officers and the powerful criminal networks they protected. But it was going to be difficult. It always was. She turned back to her desk where her phone buzzed again. She picked it up, unlocking it quickly to read the incoming message. "Stay alert. We've traced the officers back to their superior. Things are moving faster than we anticipated." Rachel's pulse quickened. She had hoped for a quiet investigation, but it seemed like the city's darkest corners were beginning to stir. The network of corruption had deep roots, and if the superior officer was involved, then things were about to get dangerous. Rachel knew that her role wasn't just to expose the corruption, it was to tear it apart piece by piece, no matter the cost. She didn't have time to waste. The next step was clear. She needed to dig deeper into the officers' movements, track their affiliations, and gather every piece of information that might help her bring them down. But she wasn't naive. The clock was ticking, and the closer she got to uncovering the truth, the more people would want to silence her. She had to move quickly and keep her cover intact. As Rachel opened her laptop to begin working on her next move, she paused for a moment. The tension in her body hadn't fully dissipated. The adrenaline from the officer's visit still coursed through her veins. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself before diving into the mountain of data she needed to sift through. Rachel knew that the only way she would be able to navigate this world of deception was by staying one step ahead. She had to act like a businesswoman, always composed, always calculating. To the world outside, Rachel Morgan was a successful CEO, a tech leader with a reputation for precision and control. But beneath that facade, she was a federal agent who had spent years working undercover, building a network of contacts within the city's underbelly. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. This time it was a call. She glanced at the screen. It was her contact from the federal agency. She hesitated for a second, then answered. "Rachel, we've been monitoring the situation," said the voice on the other end. It was Agent Carter, a seasoned investigator who had been overseeing the corruption case. "We've confirmed that the two officers you encountered are linked to a larger operation. We've traced their movements and communications, and it's worse than we thought." Rachel's heart raced as she listened closely. "How bad is it?" "We've identified several high-ranking officers involved, but the real concern is who they're working with. The corruption extends far beyond what we initially anticipated. We've also received intel that they've been tipped off about the investigation. It's only a matter of time before they try to come after you." Rachel's blood ran cold at the words. Being targeted wasn't new to her. It came with the territory of working undercover. But this felt different. This wasn't just about a few bad apples in the police force. This was a full-scale operation that spanned every level of law enforcement, and Rachel had just scratched the surface. "What's our next move?" Rachel asked, keeping her voice steady. "We need you to stay put for now. We're organizing a task force to handle the situation, but we can't risk you going public with what you know just yet. If they find out you're involved, it could jeopardize the entire operation. We'll be in touch when we have more intel." Rachel felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Staying put wasn't in her nature. She had always been the one to take charge, to lead the charge against injustice. But she understood the importance of this mission. She couldn't afford to be reckless, not when so many lives were on the line. "I understand," Rachel said, her voice unwavering. "But I need to stay informed. I can't just sit around waiting for orders. I've got my own contacts, my own way of gathering information. I'll keep working from my end. Just keep me updated." "Understood. Just be careful, Rachel. They won't hesitate to make you their target if they sense you're a threat. Don't let your guard down." After the call ended, Rachel sat back in her chair, her thoughts racing. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but the reality of the situation hit her hard. She was up against some of the most dangerous people in the city, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. Her mind turned to the officers she had encountered earlier. It was clear that they weren't acting on their own. Someone more powerful was behind them, pulling the strings. And that someone was the key to unraveling this entire operation. Rachel picked up the phone again and began to type a message to one of her trusted sources in the police department, a whistleblower who had been feeding her information for months. She needed to know everything they had on the officers involved, and she needed it fast. The city was dark, but the shadows seemed to grow longer with each passing minute. Rachel knew that the stakes were higher than ever. She was no longer just a businesswoman trying to build a successful company. She was fighting to expose a corruption that ran deeper than she had ever imagined, and she would stop at nothing to see it through. The following day, Rachel found herself in her usual routine, trying to maintain the appearance of a CEO while secretly pulling the strings behind the scenes. She knew that the officers she had encountered the night before would not be the only threat to her operation. Their superiors were likely already aware of her involvement, and the net was tightening around her. As she sat in her office, scrolling through messages, emails, and confidential reports, Rachel felt a nagging sense of urgency gnawing at her. Every moment she spent behind her desk, working in the open, felt like a wasted opportunity. She needed to dig deeper into the officers' network and understand who was pulling their strings. The corruption went far beyond a few rogue cops. This was a systemic issue that had infiltrated the highest levels of law enforcement in the city. And if she didn't act swiftly, her investigation could come to an abrupt and dangerous end. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her contact inside the police department. Rachel quickly opened it, her eyes scanning the screen. "I've got some information on the officers you encountered. They're part of a larger faction within the department. Their superior is Captain Daniel Hayes. He's got ties to several criminal organizations. Hayes is no stranger to the underground world. He's been protecting the city's most dangerous criminals for years. You'll need to be careful. He's got eyes everywhere." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as she read the message. Captain Hayes. She had heard the name before. Rumors had circulated about his connections to organized crime, but nothing concrete had ever surfaced. Until now. This wasn't just a low-level operation. It was a deeply entrenched network that stretched far beyond what Rachel had anticipated. If Captain Hayes was involved, the stakes had just escalated dramatically. She quickly texted her contact back. "I need everything you've got on Hayes. His movements, contacts, anything. This goes deeper than we thought." With the request sent, Rachel leaned back in her chair and let out a long, slow breath. She had always known that corruption ran deep in the city, but she hadn't realized just how far-reaching it was. Hayes wasn't just any officer. He was a key player in the city's criminal underworld, and now Rachel had to figure out how to expose him without blowing her cover. She quickly pulled up a secure database on her laptop, a tool she had developed with her company's surveillance technology. It allowed her to track movements, communications, and even monitor public surveillance footage, resources that were invaluable for her work as an undercover agent. She input the name, Captain Daniel Hayes, into the search bar and began sifting through the data. Within seconds, her screen was flooded with information. Hayes had been involved in multiple high-profile cases, some of which had been quietly dismissed or ruled in favor of known criminals. His record was spotless on the surface, but Rachel knew better. Beneath the surface, there were signs of corruption, leaked intelligence, suspicious behavior, and countless connections to individuals whose names were never uttered in official reports. He had a network of informants, both inside and outside the department. Rachel's fingers flew across the keyboard as she cross-referenced his known associates with criminal records and connections to the city's organized crime rings. It didn't take long to see a pattern emerging. Hayes had been serving as a gatekeeper, providing protection for some of the city's most dangerous criminals. It was becoming clearer by the minute that he had a well-established operation, one that was far more dangerous than any of the street-level thugs she had previously encountered. As Rachel worked, the door to her office opened with a quiet creak, and her assistant, Melissa, stepped inside. Rachel didn't even look up. She had learned long ago that multitasking was essential to survival in her line of work. "Ms. Morgan, there's a visitor downstairs, a detective from the precinct. He says he needs to speak with you about the software your company provides to the department," Melissa said, her voice soft but tinged with concern. Rachel paused for a moment, the words sinking in. A detective. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was trying to get to her, to disrupt her investigation. She had known this moment would come, but she had hoped for more time before it happened. "Send him up," Rachel said, her voice calm but with a touch of authority. "I'll handle it." Melissa hesitated for a brief moment before nodding and stepping out of the room. Rachel stood and quickly walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The detective's visit wasn't just a random occurrence. It was part of the growing pressure around her. As much as she wanted to ignore it and focus solely on her investigation, she knew better. The walls were closing in. She turned back to her desk and began to shuffle through some papers, ensuring that nothing incriminating was left in sight. She had prepared for this. Her office, like everything else in her life, was a carefully constructed front. A businesswoman by day, an agent by night. The balance was delicate, but Rachel had always prided herself on being able to navigate both worlds. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the detective approached her office. Her heartbeat quickened, but she maintained her composure. She had faced far more dangerous situations before, and she had always come out on top. This would be no different. The door opened, and a tall, imposing man in his early 40s stepped inside. He was dressed in a dark suit, his badge visible on his belt. Rachel noticed the sharpness in his eyes, the same kind of sharpness she had seen in others who worked in law enforcement but had become too comfortable with bending the rules. "Detective Mark Lawson," he said, extending his hand. "We need to talk about your company's involvement with the police department." Rachel shook his hand firmly, maintaining a professional smile. "Of course, Detective. Please have a seat." Lawson sat across from her, his gaze never leaving her face. Rachel could feel the weight of his scrutiny, and she knew that this conversation would be more than just a simple inquiry. She had to stay calm, stay in control. One wrong move and everything could fall apart. "We've been looking into some issues with the software your company provides," Lawson began, his tone neutral. "There have been reports of misuse, and we need to get to the bottom of it. Some officers are concerned that your systems may be compromised." Rachel kept her face impassive, even though a flicker of irritation ran through her. The detective was either being intentionally vague or he was just following orders. Either way, she couldn't afford to react. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding, Detective," Rachel said smoothly. "Our software is rigorously tested and used by departments across the city. If there's been an issue, we're more than willing to cooperate with the investigation. But I'll need specifics before we can proceed." Lawson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm afraid the specifics are classified, Ms. Morgan, but I'll make it clear. We're watching you, and if there's any indication that your company is involved in criminal activity, we'll make sure you're the first one we come after." Rachel's heart raced, but she kept her expression unchanged. This wasn't just about the software. Lawson knew more than he was letting on, and his warning was a clear message. Someone, somewhere, had given the order to intimidate her. But who? "Detective, I assure you," Rachel said, her voice steady and confident, "my company's commitment to security is unquestionable. If there's an issue, we'll address it. But I can't assist you without more concrete information." Lawson gave a tight smile, standing up to leave. "We'll be in touch, Ms. Morgan. Don't forget we're always watching." As the door closed behind him, Rachel exhaled sharply. The game had officially begun. Rachel's mind raced after the detective left her office. The conversation with Detective Lawson had been a thinly veiled threat, the kind of pressure she had become all too familiar with in her years as an undercover agent. She knew that she couldn't afford to be passive in this situation. There was no room for hesitation. The clock was ticking, and every minute wasted brought her closer to being exposed. She stood in front of the window once again, looking down at the busy streets below. The city buzzed with life, oblivious to the dangerous game unfolding behind closed doors. But Rachel wasn't like the others. She understood the risks, the stakes. She had dedicated her life to taking down the corrupt elements that stained the very fabric of the city she had sworn to protect. The officers she had encountered, the ones working under Captain Daniel Hayes, were merely a part of a much larger operation, one that involved not just the police but criminal syndicates, powerful businessmen and politicians who had sold their souls for money and power. The deeper she went, the more she realized just how deep the corruption ran. And now she had a target on her back. Rachel's phone buzzed again, breaking her thoughts. She grabbed it from the desk, quickly unlocking the screen. It was a message from her contact inside the police department, the whistleblower who had been feeding her intel for months. "Hayes knows. He's got eyes on you. I don't know how, but he's aware of your involvement. You need to move fast. I've got some intel on his next move. Meet me at the usual spot. Trust no one." Her stomach twisted with unease. Hayes had found out. How? It didn't matter now. What mattered was that her cover was compromised. She could no longer operate under the guise of a businesswoman. She was officially a target, and if she didn't act quickly, her investigation, and perhaps even her life, could be over. Rachel grabbed her coat from the back of the chair and threw it over her shoulders. She quickly checked the office for anything out of place. No sign of surveillance. No signs that anyone had been tampering with her files. For now, at least, she was safe. But that wouldn't last long. She grabbed her phone and texted Melissa, her assistant, a simple message. "I'm stepping out for a while. Hold down the fort here." There was no need to explain further. Melissa had been with her for years, and she knew better than to ask questions when things got complicated. Rachel made her way to the elevator and down to the parking garage. Her mind raced with possibilities. Hayes was a dangerous man, but he wasn't invincible. She had dealt with men like him before. The question was, how far did his influence stretch? How many people in the department had already been compromised? She got into her car, a sleek black sedan that blended in with the crowd, and drove through the city streets. She didn't take her usual route. She couldn't afford to be predictable now. Every turn she made was calculated. Every move was deliberate. As she navigated the streets, her thoughts turned to the whistleblower, the person who had been feeding her the information that had led her to Hayes in the first place. She trusted him, but she knew better than to place all her faith in a single source. In this world, betrayal was always a possibility. The spot where she was meeting him was in an old industrial area on the outskirts of the city, an area that had long been abandoned by the city's authorities. It was a place where people went to disappear, where secrets were kept in the shadows. Rachel parked her car a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way on foot. She kept her pace steady, but her senses were on high alert. She could feel the weight of the city's darkness pressing in on her. As she approached the meeting spot, a small, nondescript building at the end of an alley, she saw the figure of the whistleblower standing near the entrance. He was tall, with a broad build, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. His face was partially obscured in the dim light, but Rachel had no trouble recognizing him. "Hey, you made it," the whistleblower said, his voice low and cautious. "I didn't know if you'd show up. Thought Hayes people might have caught wind of this." Rachel nodded, her eyes scanning the area. "We don't have much time. What do you have for me?" The whistleblower handed her a small envelope. "This is everything I could find. Hayes has a plan in motion. He's meeting with someone tomorrow, someone high up. I don't know who, but it's important. If you're going to stop him, you need to move fast." Rachel opened the envelope and began to sift through the documents inside. There were photos, notes, and a detailed map of a location that looked like a warehouse on the outskirts of town. She studied the map carefully, tracing the path with her fingers. "This is it," she said quietly, more to herself than to the whistleblower. "This is where Hayes is meeting tomorrow." The whistleblower nodded grimly. "I don't know who's going to be there, but it's big. You've got to be careful. If Hayes is meeting with someone powerful, it could mean a lot more trouble for you." Rachel tucked the documents into her coat pocket. She could feel the weight of the information pressing on her chest. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for, the key to bringing Hayes and his network down. "I'll handle it from here," Rachel said, turning to leave. "Thanks for the intel." "Wait," the whistleblower called after her. "One more thing. I don't trust Hayes. He's ruthless, but he's also smart. He'll be expecting you. Be ready for anything." Rachel didn't look back as she walked away, her mind already formulating a plan. She couldn't afford to waste any time. Hayes had to be stopped. His network of corruption had to be exposed. But first, she needed to get to the warehouse and find out who he was meeting. This was the break she had been waiting for, the moment that could turn the tide in her favor. She quickly made her way back to her car, but as she turned the corner, a dark figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking her path. Rachel's instincts kicked in, her hand going to the gun hidden in her coat. But before she could react, the figure stepped forward, and a familiar voice echoed through the alley. "Not so fast, Rachel," the voice said. It was Detective Lawson. Rachel froze. She had been set up. Rachel's heart raced as she stood motionless in the alley, her senses heightened, every muscle in her body ready to spring into action. Detective Lawson's presence was an immediate threat, one she hadn't expected so soon. His figure was blocking her escape, his stance confident, but there was an edge to his voice that hinted at something deeper, something more dangerous. Rachel's mind raced as she assessed her options. She knew she couldn't afford to show any signs of weakness, not with someone like Lawson in front of her. This was no longer a mere intimidation tactic. This was a confrontation that could decide everything. "Detective," Rachel said, her voice calm but laced with cold authority. "I didn't expect to see you here. Shouldn't you be out there solving real crimes instead of chasing after me?" Lawson chuckled darkly, stepping closer, his eyes gleaming with a sense of satisfaction that made Rachel's skin crawl. "You're clever, Morgan, too clever for your own good. You think you're one step ahead of everyone, don't you? But you're wrong. You've been playing a dangerous game, and it's about time someone put an end to it." Rachel didn't flinch. She couldn't. The situation had shifted dramatically, and she knew she had to stay composed if she was going to survive this encounter. She could feel the weight of the gun against her side, a reminder that she wasn't completely powerless. But pulling it out would only escalate things, and right now, she needed information. She needed to understand why Lawson was here and what he intended to do. "I'm not sure I follow, Detective," Rachel said, her voice now a little sharper. "What game are you talking about? Lawson's smile widened and he took a step closer, his voice lowering as he spoke with a sense of menace. You've been poking around where you don't belong, Rachel. Hayes doesn't take kindly to people who interfere with his operations, especially people like you. You've been digging into things that are far beyond your pay grade and now you're starting to cause problems. The thing is, you've made a mistake. You should have stayed out of this. Rachel narrowed her eyes. This was no longer just about the software her company provided. Lawson's words confirmed her suspicions. Hayes was at the center of a much larger operation, one that she had been unknowingly threatening with every step she took. But why was Lawson so invested in stopping her? Was he a pawn in Hayes' game, or was there something more? I'm not afraid of you, Lawson, Rachel said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. I'm here to clean up the mess that people like you have created. If you're here to threaten me, you're wasting your time. Lawson's expression hardened, the amusement fading from his face as he closed the distance between them. You really think you can take down Hayes? You have no idea who you're dealing with. He's got connections all over this city, powerful people, and you're just a businesswoman who got in over her head. Rachel's mind raced as Lawson's words sank in. She had suspected that Hayes' network ran deep, but hearing it from someone so close to the action made it all the more real. This wasn't just about exposing a few bad cops. This was a sprawling criminal enterprise with its roots in every corner of the city's power structure. If she didn't stop Hayes now, he would continue to manipulate the system for his own gain, destroying everything in his path. Maybe you're right, Lawson, Rachel said, her voice softer now, trying to draw him in. Maybe I don't know everything, but I do know one thing: I'm not going to let Hayes get away with what he's doing, and neither are you. Lawson's eyes flickered for a split second, a moment of doubt breaking through his otherwise steely demeanor. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by a dark smile. You're naive, Rachel. You think you can change things. You're just a blip in Hayes' plan. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about anyone. You're a liability now, and you're going to regret getting involved. Rachel didn't respond immediately. She was piecing together what she had learned. Lawson wasn't just an obstacle. He was part of the system that kept the corruption alive. He was trying to intimidate her into backing down, to make her feel small and powerless. But Rachel had never been one to back down. In fact, her entire career had been built on the idea of fighting back against injustice. And now, she was facing the biggest fight of her life. Here's the thing, Lawson, Rachel said, her voice low and steady. I'm not afraid of your threats. I've dealt with people like you before, and I've taken them down. I've got resources, connections that you can't even begin to understand. So if you think you're going to intimidate me into walking away, you're wrong. I'll expose Hayes and his entire operation, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. Lawson's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed as he took another step toward her, his face now inches from hers. You think you can just walk away from this? You think anyone is going to care about your so-called investigation? You're nothing but a target, Morgan. You're just a pawn in a game much bigger than you. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she stood her ground. The threat was real, but she wasn't about to let Lawson see her sweat. She had spent years studying people like him, men who thought they were untouchable, who believed they could get away with anything. But she knew the truth. Everyone had a weakness, and Lawson's was his ego. You know, Lawson, Rachel said, taking a deliberate step back. The thing about people like you is that you always underestimate the people you're trying to control. You think you've got all the power, but you're not the one pulling the strings. Hayes might have the connections, but you're just another piece of the puzzle, and you're about to be exposed. Lawson sneered. You really think you can threaten me? I'm not scared of you. I'll make sure you regret every step you've taken. Before Rachel could respond, A sound echoed in the distance, the unmistakable hum of a car engine growing louder by the second. Her mind raced. She had no time to waste. Lawson was a threat, but he wasn't the only one in the game. She had to make her move before Hayes could act. She turned quickly, pretending to walk away, but in a split second she spun around, her hand slipping into her coat pocket. In a smooth motion, she pulled out a small device, a tracker she had planted earlier in the meeting with the whistleblower. It was a simple tool, but it would give her the edge she needed. Lawson barely had time to react before Rachel tossed the device at him, its small metal casing hitting him in the chest. He staggered back, confused for a moment, but before he could regain his composure, Rachel took her chance. She lunged forward, her hand reaching for her sidearm, but before she could pull it out, Lawson's grip was on her wrist, twisting painfully. "You really thought I'd let you get away that easy?" Lawson growled, his voice low with fury. "I'm going to make sure you never see daylight again." Rachel grimaced as his grip tightened, but she wasn't finished yet. With a sudden burst of strength, she drove her knee into Lawson's stomach, pushing him back just enough to break free. The moment he staggered, she was on him, her gun in her hand. She leveled it at him, her finger hovering over the trigger. "Try me," Rachel said, her voice cold and unwavering. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Rachel's breath was shallow, her gun steady in her hand, pointing directly at Detective Lawson. His face was contorted with shock, anger, and a hint of disbelief. He hadn't expected her to fight back, let alone gain the upper hand. Rachel's pulse thudded in her ears as she kept her eyes locked on his. The game had changed, no longer just a battle of wits and surveillance, but a raw, violent standoff. Lawson's hand hovered near his holster, but Rachel knew he wouldn't draw his weapon, not with a gun trained on him. She had the advantage, and for the first time in this chaotic investigation, she felt in control. "Listen to me," Rachel said, her voice unwavering. "This doesn't have to go any further. I know you're not completely loyal to Hayes. You're just another piece in his puzzle, but you have a choice." Lawson's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You really think I'm going to listen to you? You're nothing but a fugitive in this city, a ghost. You're alone in this, Morgan. You have no backup." Rachel's eyes narrowed as she took a step forward, keeping her gun trained on Lawson. She knew he was trying to provoke her, to make her doubt herself, but she wasn't about to let him have that satisfaction. "I have more than enough backup," she replied, her voice steady, "and you're about to find out just how deep I've dug." A silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint sound of distant traffic. Lawson stood frozen, his eyes darting between Rachel's gun and her face. She could see the cogs turning in his mind as he tried to make sense of the situation. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't dealing with just another ambitious businesswoman anymore. Rachel Morgan was a force to be reckoned with. "You've underestimated me," she said coldly, her eyes narrowing. "And that's your mistake." Lawson's hand dropped from his holster, and for a moment Rachel thought he was going to make a move. Instead, he slowly raised his hands in surrender. His posture was stiff, his jaw clenched. He was seething, but he knew better than to provoke her further. "You think you can take Hayes down, don't you?" Lawson spat, his voice full of disdain. "You have no idea what you're up against. He's not like the others you've taken down before. He's untouchable." Rachel's eyes flashed with determination. "No one is untouchable, Lawson. Not Hayes, not you, and certainly not me." A slight shift in the air made her pause. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone else was nearby. The faint sound of footsteps, muffled at first but growing closer with each passing second. Rachel's instincts kicked into overdrive. She knew the game was about to change again. There was no time to waste. She couldn't let Lawson's words distract her from the bigger picture. Before she could react, the figure stepped into view, a tall man in a dark trench coat, his face shadowed by a brimmed hat. Rachel instinctively tightened her grip on the gun, her eyes darting between Lawson and the newcomer. But to her surprise, Lawson stepped back and lowered his arms. The tension in his posture softened slightly, though the hostility was still evident. "Detective Lawson," the newcomer's voice rang out deep and calm, "I think it's time we had a chat." Rachel's eyes narrowed, confusion briefly clouding her judgment. Who was this man, and why was Lawson so willing to back off? Lawson didn't look at her but instead addressed the stranger with a strange mixture of fear and respect. "You shouldn't be here," Lawson said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "You don't know what you're getting into." The man's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm getting into, but I'm not the one who needs to be worried right now." Rachel's mind was reeling. She had been so focused on Lawson and Hayes that she hadn't anticipated another player in this deadly game. Who was this man, and why was Lawson backing down? The stranger stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Rachel's. His movements were slow, deliberate, and almost predatory. Rachel instinctively shifted her weight, ready for anything. But he didn't make any sudden moves. Instead, he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Rachel Morgan," he said, his tone dark and full of quiet menace, "you've made a lot of noise recently. People are starting to take notice." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. He knew her name. He knew everything. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her cool, her eyes scanning him for any hint of weakness. "Who are you?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. The man didn't immediately answer. He took another slow step forward and Rachel's gun tightened in response. But he wasn't intimidated. His smirk deepened and he finally spoke. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been keeping an eye on Hayes' little operation. I have interests in this city much like he does. The difference is I don't have his kind of baggage. I prefer to work in the shadows." Rachel's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. This man was no ordinary player. He had some kind of connection to Hayes, but he wasn't like the corrupt officers she had dealt with. This man had power, real power. "What do you want?" Rachel asked, her voice sharper now. She had no patience for games. She was on the brink of uncovering something far bigger than she had anticipated, and she didn't have time to waste with cryptic threats. The man chuckled softly, and it was a sound that sent a chill down Rachel's spine. "What do I want? Oh, Rachel, that's the wrong question. The question is, what do you want?" Rachel narrowed her eyes. "I want to stop Hayes and expose his entire operation." The man's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "You really think you can do that? Hayes has the city in his pocket. He has the power, the resources. You're just one person. What makes you think you can stand against him?" Rachel stood tall, her posture unwavering. "Because I'm not just anyone. I've been playing this game long enough to know how to win, and I'm not backing down now." The man studied her for a moment, as though weighing her words. Then, without a word, he turned to Lawson. "Detective, I think you've outlived your usefulness," the stranger said, his voice calm but cold. "You're no longer needed here." Lawson's expression shifted, the defiance fading from his face as the stranger's words sank in. For a moment, the two men exchanged a silent understanding, one that spoke volumes. "You're making a mistake," Lawson spat. "You don't know what you're doing." The stranger's smile widened. "On the contrary, detective, I know exactly what I'm doing." Before Rachel could react, the man turned sharply, heading toward the shadows, his figure disappearing into the night. The tension in the alley was palpable, and Rachel knew that things had just escalated in ways she couldn't have predicted. She stood in silence, the gun still in her hand, her mind racing. There were more players in this game than she had ever imagined, and now the true battle had begun. Rachel's hands tightened around the grip of her gun as the shadowy figure melted into the darkness. She didn't lower it, even when she heard the faint echoes of footsteps retreating into the night. Everything in the alley seemed to hold its breath for a moment, as if the world itself was unsure of what had just transpired. She stood frozen, her mind reeling from the sudden appearance of this new player, a man who had known too much and been too calm in the face of imminent danger. Lawson, now completely silent, didn't move either. He stood a few feet away, his hands still raised in mock surrender, but there was no mistaking the hesitation in his stance. This was no longer a simple standoff between a detective and an undercover agent. It was something much larger. Hayes was only part of it. The real forces at play were now closing in on Rachel, and she could feel the weight of that realization in her bones. "Who was that?" Rachel finally asked, her voice steady despite the storm swirling in her chest. Lawson didn't answer immediately. He remained oddly quiet, perhaps processing the same questions racing through her mind. His eyes flickered, betraying a mix of anger and fear. It was clear he didn't want to speak, but Rachel knew better than to wait. She wasn't about to let this moment slip away. "I said, who the hell was that?" she repeated, her tone now laced with ice. Lawson hesitated for a beat longer, his jaw clenching in frustration. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his eyes narrowing as he met her gaze. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he muttered. Rachel didn't have time to play games. She stepped forward, her gun still trained on him, though her grip loosened just slightly. "Try me." His eyes darted to the shadows where the man had disappeared and back to Rachel. "His name, Elijah. He's not like the rest of us. He's above it all." Rachel's brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of Lawson's words. "Above it all," she repeated, her voice thick with confusion. "What does that even mean? Who is he working for?" Lawson shifted uncomfortably, his posture rigid. "He doesn't work for anyone," he said, almost reluctantly. He's the one people answer to. Hayes works for him. A lot of the power in this city comes from people like him, people who control things from the shadows. They don't care about the law. They don't care about anything but their own power." Rachel's mind raced as she processed Lawson's words. This man, Elijah, was somehow above the law, above Hayes, and seemed to control much more than she had anticipated. He wasn't just a part of the system, he was its puppet master. And if Hayes was working for him, then the corruption Rachel was trying to expose was far deeper and more entrenched than she had imagined. "So you're telling me Hayes isn't the one running the show?" Rachel asked, her voice edged with disbelief. "That man, Elijah, has more power than Hayes." Lawson's eyes dropped to the ground, and for a brief moment Rachel thought he might not answer. But then he spoke, his voice quieter, almost resigned. "Yes, Hayes is just a tool. Elijah is the real threat. He's the one who makes the calls. He's untouchable, Rachel." The weight of those words hit Rachel like a freight train. She had known that corruption in the city ran deep, but this was something entirely different. She was no longer just fighting against a corrupt cop or a few rogue officers. Elijah was the heart of the operation, the man who had his hands in everything. And if she wanted to bring down Hayes and the entire network, she was going to have to take on someone far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Rachel asked, her voice a mix of frustration and betrayal. Lawson didn't meet her eyes. "Because you wouldn't have believed me," he said. "No one does. Elijah is a ghost. He's a myth for most people, but he's real and he's watching. You're playing with fire, Morgan." Rachel felt the burn of betrayal deep in her chest. Lawson had known this whole time, but he had kept it from her, whether out of fear or because he simply didn't think she could handle the truth. Either way, she was beyond caring about his reasons now. Elijah was her new target, the man she needed to expose, to dismantle. But first, she had to figure out how to get to him. Rachel lowered the gun, the tension in her muscles easing just slightly. "Where do I find him?" she asked, her voice steady, but her mind churning with 1,000 thoughts. Lawson shook his head. "I don't know," he replied. "No one does. He's always one step ahead. He controls everything through people like Hayes. He's got eyes everywhere. You'd never get close to him." Rachel's frustration flared, but she kept her composure. She had been through worse. She'd been on the run before, hunted by people who thought they could break her. Elijah wouldn't be the one to take her down. "I'll find him," Rachel said, her voice cold and resolute. "One way or another, I'll get to him." Lawson's eyes flickered with doubt, but he didn't argue. Instead, he seemed to make a decision. "If you're serious about this," he said, his tone shifting, "I can help you. But you have to promise me something. No matter what happens, you don't go after Elijah alone." Rachel's eyes narrowed as she studied Lawson. She knew better than to trust him completely, but there was a strange honesty in his words, a sense of something buried beneath his hardened exterior. Maybe he had his own reasons for wanting to take down Elijah, or maybe he just wanted to redeem himself for his part in all of this. Whatever his reasons were, Rachel knew that for now, he was the closest thing she had to an ally. "Fine," she said, her voice firm. "But if you're going to help me, you better stay out of my way. I don't have time for half measures." Lawson nodded reluctantly. "I'm not here to slow you down, Morgan, but you need to be careful. This isn't just about stopping a few crooked cops. Elijah's network goes far beyond anything you've seen. He's got his hands in everything: business, politics, the police. You can't trust anyone." Rachel took a deep breath, absorbing Lawson's warning. She knew the risks, but she couldn't back down now. She had made it this far, and she was closer than ever to taking down the heart of the corruption. Hayes was a stepping stone, but Elijah was the real target, and she was going to take him down. "Thanks for the warning," she said, her voice now softer but still firm. "But I'm going to finish this my way." Lawson didn't argue. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows just as quickly as he had appeared. Rachel watched him go, her mind already focused on the next step. Elijah was the key. If she could take him down, she could bring the whole operation crumbling to the ground. But first, she had to find him. And that would be no easy task. The days that followed were a blur of surveillance, research, and careful maneuvering. Rachel had always prided herself on her ability to stay one step ahead of her enemies, but now the stakes were higher than ever. Elijah's reach was long, his power far greater than she had anticipated, and the more she uncovered, the more she realized just how deep the rot went. The city itself was a labyrinth, with corrupt cops, politicians, and businessmen all feeding into one another's power. And at the center of it all was Elijah, the puppet master who controlled everything from the shadows. Rachel knew she couldn't afford to waste time. She needed to find Elijah and fast, but every move she made felt like it was being watched. The people she thought she could trust were becoming fewer by the day. Even Lawson, despite his claims of helping her, remained an enigma. She couldn't shake the feeling that he still had secrets, things he wasn't telling her. And in this world, secrets were dangerous. Her first priority was to get closer to Hayes. Elijah may have been the mastermind, but Hayes was still a significant piece of the puzzle. Rachel needed to understand his motivations, his connections, and his vulnerabilities. He was powerful, but he was also a man, and all men had weaknesses. She had to exploit them before he could do the same to her. One evening, as Rachel sat in her car parked near Hayes' residence, she reviewed the latest intel. She had tracked him for days, watching his every move. He was a creature of habit, always taking the same route to work, always stopping at the same cafe for his morning coffee. It was in those mundane moments that Rachel found her opening. If she was going to get to Elijah, she first needed to get close to Hayes. And tonight, she had a plan. She watched as Hayes emerged from his home, his posture confident and purposeful, the image of a man who believed himself invincible. She couldn't help but feel a sense of disdain as she observed him. He was a cog in a much larger machine, a machine that was fueled by corruption and greed. He was just another player in a game that had been rigged from the start. Rachel waited until he was a few steps from his car, then pulled out her phone, sending a quick message to her contact in the police department. Hayes is leaving his residence now. Get someone to monitor his route. She had a network of informants, people who could provide her with the inside scoop on Hayes' daily activities, and she wasn't afraid to use them. As Hayes drove away, Rachel followed at a safe distance, making sure to stay out of his line of sight. She knew that if she got too close, he would suspect something. But if she stayed too far, she risked losing him entirely. It was a delicate balance, one that she had mastered over the years. Hayes' route took him through several of the city's more affluent neighborhoods, and as Rachel followed, she noticed a pattern. He was heading toward a private club on the outskirts of town, a place known for its exclusivity and secrecy. Rachel's pulse quickened. This was it. This was where the real action was happening. She parked a few blocks away, ensuring that she had a clear view of the entrance. From here, she could observe everything without drawing attention to herself. The club was a sprawling mansion, surrounded by tall gates and security cameras. It was the kind of place where only the most powerful could gain entry, and Rachel had no intention of being left on the outside. She waited for what felt like hours, her eyes never leaving the entrance. And then she saw him. Hayes entered the club, flanked by two of his men, their stern faces betraying no emotion. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. This was her moment. She had to move now. With a deep breath, she exited her car and made her way toward the gates. The security was tight, but she had planned for this. She had done her homework. The club's security system was top of the line, but there was one weak link. The guard at the entrance, a man named Greg, who had been a part of her network for months. She had promised him a favor in exchange for information, and tonight was the night she would collect. Greg was sitting at the guard booth, looking bored as he scrolled through his phone. Rachel approached him slowly, making sure to stay out of view of the cameras. She had no intention of using force. She just needed to get inside. "Greg," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach his ears. He looked up, his eyes widening when he saw her. "Rachel," he whispered, quickly standing up from his chair. "What are you doing here?" "I need to get in," Rachel replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "You know why." Greg hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering toward the security cameras before he nodded. "I'll let you in, but you've got to hurry. If anyone finds out I helped you—" "I know," Rachel interrupted, offering him a reassuring smile. "I won't take long." He nodded again and reached for the control panel. Within seconds, the gate creaked open and Rachel slipped inside. She knew she didn't have much time. The longer she stayed, the greater the chance of being caught. But she was determined. This was her chance to get closer to Hayes, to find out who he was meeting and why. And if she was lucky, she might just find the evidence she needed to bring him down. The club was more extravagant than she had imagined. Luxurious decor, soft lighting, and the faint hum of hushed conversations. She moved quickly through the crowds, blending in with the other guests, careful not to attract attention. The last thing she needed was to be recognized. She made her way toward the back of the club where Hayes had gone earlier. There were fewer people here, and the air was thick with tension. This was where the real deals were made, where the power players of the city met in secret. And it was here, in the shadows, that Rachel hoped to find her answers. She rounded a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. There, in a private room at the end of the hallway, she saw Hayes speaking with a man in a sharp suit. Rachel couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the way Hayes was deferential, how the man seemed to command the room without saying a word. This was it, Elijah. Her heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that could change everything. She had to act quickly but carefully. One wrong move and everything would be over. She pulled out her phone, sending a quick message to her contact. "I've found him. Elijah is with Hayes. Need backup." Rachel's eyes stayed fixed on the scene before her as she waited, her mind calculating the next steps. She couldn't let Elijah slip through her fingers. Not this time. This was her chance to bring the whole operation down. But as she waited for her backup to arrive, something inside her began to stir. Something didn't feel right. The atmosphere had changed. She could feel eyes on her, cold, calculating eyes. Someone knew she was here, and that someone was about to make their move. Rachel's pulse quickened as she instinctively pressed her back against the wall, her eyes scanning the room for the source of the discomfort gnawing at her. There was no visible sign of immediate danger, but she could feel it, the sense that the walls were closing in, that she was being watched. The luxurious sounds of the club's background music now felt distant, muted by the thudding of her heart. She had found Elijah. She had found the man at the center of the web of corruption she had been working tirelessly to untangle. The figure she had spent weeks chasing, researching, and surveilling was now in her sights. But something about the way he carried himself, the authority in his posture, made her hesitate. As she pressed herself further into the shadows, Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, keeping her movements as discreet as possible. It was a text from her contact, the one who had been helping her stay one step ahead of the operation. "We're on our way, but be careful. Elijah is not to be underestimated. Watch your back." The text was brief, but it was enough. She already knew the danger she was in. Elijah wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was someone who moved in the highest circles of power. His reach extended far beyond the criminal world. He had politicians, law enforcement officers, and businessmen at his beck and call. And she was about to walk right into his lion's den. Rachel's mind raced through her options. Her backup was on the way, but she couldn't rely on them to get here in time. If she waited for reinforcements, she would lose her shot at Elijah and everything she had worked for. If she confronted him now, she risked exposing her entire operation. And worse, she could be walking into a trap. She needed to stay sharp. She reached into her jacket, where she had hidden a small, concealed earpiece. It connected her to her team. She slid it into her ear, the cool plastic a small comfort in the whirlwind of uncertainty swirling inside her. "Rachel, you there?" A voice crackled through the earpiece. It was Mark, her most trusted contact within the department. "I'm here," Rachel whispered back, keeping her voice as low as possible. "I'm at the club. I've located Elijah. He's meeting with Hayes in the private room." "Got it, stay put. We'll be there in 5 minutes. You're not alone." Rachel's grip tightened around her phone as she surveyed the area, making sure there were no threats closing in on her. There was no time to waste. She had to act fast. The moment Elijah had stepped into the private room, she had instinctively recognized him. There was a calmness about him that radiated power. He wasn't a typical criminal, the kind that relied on force or intimidation. He was a puppet master, calm, calculated, and always several steps ahead of his opponents. His dark eyes scanned the room, and for a split second, Rachel thought she saw him glance in her direction. It was only for a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Her stomach dropped. He knew she was here. Her hand instinctively moved to the gun holstered at her side, but she knew it would do her no good in this situation. If she pulled it now, she would be exposed, vulnerable. It was better to observe, to gather more intel. Elijah turned to Hayes, who was standing across from him, his posture slightly tense but respectful. Rachel could hear the low murmur of their conversation, but she couldn't make out the words. What was Elijah telling Hayes? What deals were being struck? This was the moment that could reveal everything. The silence between them felt oppressive. Elijah had a way of commanding attention without saying much. His presence was enough to make people nervous, make them follow his every move, and Rachel was no exception. She carefully moved closer, edging toward the doorway of the private room. She needed to get closer to hear more, to understand what Elijah was planning next. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to back off, to retreat to safety, but she couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close. The door creaked slightly as she shifted her weight, but it wasn't loud enough to alert Elijah or Hayes. Her breath caught in her throat as she leaned in just a little further, trying to make sense of the conversation. But it was then that everything seemed to freeze. A shift in the air, a rustling of clothing, and then the unmistakable sound of a voice. "Are you enjoying the show, Ms. Morgan?" Rachel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was smooth, almost too smooth. She recognized it instantly. It was Elijah. He had known she was here all along. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Her cover was blown. She turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her gun. But it was Elijah standing in the doorway. It was a man she hadn't expected, Greg, the security guard she had relied on to get into the club. "What's going on, Greg?" Rachel asked, her voice tight with disbelief. Greg's face was expressionless, his eyes cold. "You shouldn't have come here, Rachel. This was never supposed to be your fight." Rachel's stomach twisted in anger and betrayal. She had trusted Greg, had believed in the information he'd provided. But now it was clear that she had misjudged him. He had been working for Elijah all along. "I should have known," Rachel muttered under her breath, trying to make sense of the situation. "How deep does this go, Greg?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small earpiece, attaching it to his ear. "Elijah's orders," he said, his voice flat. "I'm supposed to keep you here. You're not going anywhere." Rachel's eyes widened as she realized the gravity of the situation. She was trapped. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't reach for it. It was too dangerous. There was no time to call for backup. She had to think fast. She had to find a way out. Greg stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "It's over, Rachel. You're not getting out of here." In that moment, the weight of her mission crashed down on her. She had underestimated the people she was up against. Elijah had not only infiltrated the highest levels of power, but he had his spies everywhere. The game had changed. She was no longer just trying to expose the corruption in the city. She was fighting for her life. But Rachel wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "I don't think you understand, Greg," she said, her voice cold with determination. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." She took a step back, calculating her next move. It was time to play her final card. Rachel's mind raced as she assessed her situation. The room was closing in on her. Greg was standing in front of the door, his cold eyes locking onto hers with the finality of someone who believed the game was over. But she wasn't about to let that happen. Not when she was so close to unraveling everything. Her hand remained steady on her gun, but she knew she couldn't draw it without putting herself in immediate danger. If she fired, Greg would shoot back. There were too many variables now, too many unknowns. But she wasn't just going to stand there like a deer in headlights. She had a plan. She always had a plan. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again, this time more urgently. She could feel the weight of it, knowing that her team was still out there, waiting to hear from her. Mark had promised to be there in 5 minutes, but with the way things had spiraled out of control, she wasn't sure if that window was still open. The clock was ticking, but it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finishing the job. She had started this mission to bring down Hayes, but she was in too deep now. Elijah had to go down. If she backed out now, it would be an endless cycle of corruption and betrayal. And that wasn't something Rachel could live with. "I didn't think you'd be this easy to manipulate, Rachel," Greg said, his voice low. "You've always been the smart one, the one who thinks she's ahead of the game, but you're just a pawn. You've always been a pawn." Rachel's eyes flickered to the corner of the room, where a small decorative lamp sat on the table. She couldn't help but notice how precariously close it was to the edge, how it might easily fall with just the right push. Her mind worked quickly, analyzing the angles, the probabilities. Greg was focused on her. He wasn't looking at the room, at the things that could be used as distractions. Without missing a beat, Rachel darted toward the lamp. Her motion was swift and deliberate. She grabbed it, throwing it across the room with all the force she could muster. The lamp crashed against the wall, sending a loud noise echoing through the room. Greg, startled, turned sharply toward the sound, his gun momentarily diverted from Rachel. That was all the opening she needed. Rachel moved quickly, closing the distance between them in a flash. She tackled Greg with the precision of someone who had faced worse odds in her life. Her knee connected with his chest as she shoved him against the door, using her body weight to pin him in place. His breath was forced from his lungs in a gasp as she gripped his gun hand, twisting it until it was no longer a threat. "Not so easy, Greg," she hissed, her voice low with intensity. Greg's struggle against her grip intensified, but he was no match for her. With a final twist, she disarmed him and threw the gun to the side. She knew it was a temporary win. Greg was bigger, stronger, but she had the element of surprise, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. She took a step back, watching him as he struggled to regain his composure, now vulnerable and disarmed. There was no time to waste. Rachel had to move now. She grabbed his earpiece from the table where it had fallen and activated it, her fingers working with an urgency she hadn't felt in years. "Elijah," she spoke into the earpiece, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You're done." There was a brief silence, and then Elijah's voice crackled through the earpiece as smooth as ever. "Ah, Rachel, I wondered when you'd show up. You always were persistent, but you're too late." Rachel's jaw clenched as she moved toward the door. She wasn't going to let Elijah play his games any longer. "I'm not late. You're done. It's over, Elijah. You're not untouchable." There was a brief laugh on the other end, and Rachel could practically hear the smirk in Elijah's voice. "You think you can bring me down? You don't know what you're dealing with. I have people power, far beyond anything you can comprehend." "I know exactly what you have," Rachel shot back, her voice a quiet promise. "And it won't save you. You can run, but it won't make a difference." With that, Rachel ended the call. Her mind flashed to the plan she'd laid out, to everything she had uncovered in her investigation. The operation was moving now, and this was her moment. She wasn't going to let Elijah slip away. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her focus, and she turned just in time to see Mark and his team burst through the door, their guns drawn but not pointed at her. They had arrived. "Rachel, are you all right?" Mark asked, his voice laced with concern but also admiration. He knew better than to question her actions at this point. He had seen what she was capable of. "I'm fine," she said, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. "But we need to move fast. Elijah's time is up." Mark nodded, signaling his team to sweep the area. They quickly disarmed Greg, securing him in the corner of the room while Rachel began to relay what she knew. She had tracked Elijah's connections, his ties to the city's elite, his hidden assets, his secret meetings. Everything was in place. It was time to take him down. For good. "Is it over?" Greg's voice came from behind them, filled with both disbelief and anger. "You think you've won." Rachel turned to him, her face a mask of determination. "It's over for you," she said coldly. "You chose the wrong side." The door to the private room was flung open, and Elijah's smug figure stood in the doorway, flanked by several of his men. But there was no fear in his eyes, just a cold, calculated confidence that made Rachel's blood run cold. He was a man who had survived on power, and he wasn't going to let go without a fight. "You should have stayed away, Rachel," Elijah said, his voice smooth, almost pitying. "You're too small to make a difference in this world. You're nothing." Rachel stepped forward, not flinching at his words. She had heard them all before. "You're right," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm nothing, but I'm taking everything you've built down with me." And with that, the final battle began. It wasn't the kind of battle that played out in violence, in gunfire. It was a battle of minds, of strategy and determination. Elijah's network was vast, but Rachel's was faster, sharper. Her team moved swiftly, disabling Elijah's communications, cutting off his ties to his power base. They had spent weeks building the case, and now it was time to bring it to a head. Minutes later, the authorities were on the scene, led by Mark and backed by Rachel's meticulous planning. Elijah was arrested, his empire crumbling as law enforcement moved in to seize his assets, his connections, his influence. The city would be different now. The corruption that had once seemed like an insurmountable force was being dismantled, piece by piece. Rachel stood outside the club, her eyes focused on the horizon. The sun was rising, casting a soft light over the city. The battle was over. Elijah was behind bars, haze, network dismantled, and the power structures of the city beginning to shift. She had won,